Hi everyone, my name is Paula Callus. I'm a senior lecturer in the computer animation department in the Faculty of Media and Communication at Bournemouth University. So initially I was invited to come and give a keynote lecture for the undergraduate research conference that was going to look at journeys of research, largely informed by my own research, which has taken me to loads of different places in the world and is focused on actually the sub-Saharan region where I researched namely animation and the histories of animation in sub-Saharan Africa. So due to recent events around the George Floyd killing and the Black Lives Matters protests, which have been happening over the past 2 weeks or so, I felt it was really important to change the focus of the talk and perhaps to look at how women artists in Nigeria are presenting aspects around gender and political voice in their own work. So this lecture was based on a talk that I've been preparing for the National Gallery, which is part of a larger event that looks at art, digital technology and gender. So thank you very much for the invite. I'm really glad to be contributing to this event. As you mentioned, my research predominantly deals with working with artists from the sub-Saharan region, and currently I'm working on an AHRC project called The Articulations of Politics in Nigeria. So some of this presentation is informed by that research, and I decided for the purpose of the talk to focus upon an understanding of gender that is culturally and spatially located, by looking at the work specifically of 4 different women artists. So firstly, I'd like us to consider gender and space in a number of different ways. I'd like to think about the spaces and places that are gendered, and by that I mean spaces that women occupy that serve to construct ideas about what it means to be a Nigerian woman, and spaces where women are excluded that may be tied to long-standing histories of the patriarchy. I'd like to think about the convergences of spaces and practices as played out in these women's work. So how do technologies straddle real and digital spaces, and how are women representing themselves in the gallery, but equally on social media, WhatsApp, Vimeo, etc. Artists in Nigeria, it should be said, are really used to working with a multiplicity of media, and typically they have a repertoire of work that straddles like a range of different formats. So I'm interested as well in looking at these convergences that can take place between long-standing traditions and also contemporary practices. And then finally, I want to think about space more as a conceptual space that's opened up by these women's art that enable political voice. So to understand and talk about culturally located notions of gender in Nigeria, really one needs to understand that Nigeria encompasses multiple identities across various regions, and that these identities move and flow across different spaces. So there are over 400 languages spoken in Nigeria, and whether one is Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa, or Edo speaking, then these identities sort of intersect and play out in the constitution and the politics of gender. So it's important to note that the material circumstances of women and their political interests are themselves historically and geographically specific, and therefore cannot be framed in terms of gender alone. And for this reason, in a sense, I'm looking at intersectionality as a key to identity, looking at the overlaps between gender, class, and provenance, and how these are informing the Nigerian women's artists' work. So, Nigeria has experienced a tumultuous history under different military regimes, and freedom of expression has often been tested by different players, with attempts to silence and suppress voices that might challenge the powerful. However, the emergence and proliferation of mobile phone technologies and the rise of social media has created a space where Nigerians are able to express themselves more freely about religion, culture, politics, and family. And whilst access to digital technologies isn't always equitable, mobile phone technologies are prolific. And so many emerging artists are taking to social media to represent their work and engage with different networks. In some instances, they're circumventing institutional gatekeeping that can happen that serves to support patriarchal structures. So some of the examples you can see on the slides I've put up so far are examples of these emergent artists that are using digital spaces to share their work. And so whilst much of the art we're going to be looking at today is framed by the applications of technology to examine and reframe questions around gender, the artists that I want to focus upon are used to working with a multiplicity of media and therefore have a repertoire of work that straddles a range of different spaces. So the first artist I wanted to begin with was Pejula. So in her solo exhibition, Indigo Reimagined, Pejula focuses upon gendered spaces of indigo dyeing for the textile adire. So what you can see on screen is part of a larger installation, which is a patchwork made up of swatches of the Indigo Dye Textile. So this textile is produced and sold in gendered spaces. Indigo dyeing is a practice that is only done by women, and the markets in the Yoruba-speaking markets are managed by women. So Oje Market Day is a reference to a specific market in Ibadan that sells this textile. And of course, conceptually, it's worth thinking about how the use of textile can be seen as subversive, as it's using a gendered material. And this is something that other artists also return to in their work. So Adire El Eco uses resist technique to create the patterns, and the pattern motifs are usually handed down from mother to daughter. Leewola's work draws attention to the important role of the textile, but also as a symbolic object, as a historical record, and as artistic expression in its own right. And that's really important in a context where art tend to be framed in more conventional notions of, for example, a painting on canvas. So she's really reframing the technologies of making adire, looking at indigo parts and the stamps and seeing them as something that could be sculptural. Within that, of course, she's looking at the iconography of the stamps and embedding a new iconography into the lexicon by introducing things like the digital emoji, which you can see here. So for me, it's quite interesting how you have these convergences and a reinvention of the practices of indigo dyeing. Ngozi Shomers is a Nigerian artist who also addresses issues around politics, religion, identity, and gender. The work I wanted to talk about today is specifically a piece that she was commissioned for Artex Lagos, which took place in November 2019. The performance was called If Not For a Child, and it took place in a public space, but began life in a digital space, where Ngozi Shomers put a call out on social media for participants to join her in this performance. If Not For a Child is a performance and installation which questions the expectation of motherhood as a primary source of value for women in Nigeria. Using the Igbo tradition of Umogwo as a point of departure, Ngozi puts a question out to Nigerian society about the value of women and the need for them to be a mother. So Umogwo centers around the care of a woman who has recently given birth. And typically the mother would stay with her for an amount of time and then return back to her community. Upon returning back to her community, she usually is given a set of gifts, some of which you can see here in the performance. So it might be the textile as the wrapper, one of the gifts, salt is another, soap and schnapps. And then when she returns back to the community, she's usually welcomed by a song, and then these gifts are shared out with other women in the community. Based on personal research from her mother and grandmother, Ngozi translates this song, and then which loosely translates as, if not for a child, who will give me? and then puts that question to society by saying, if not for a child, am I of any value here? And of course, here she's challenging societal norms about the expectation for women in Nigeria to have children. As an artist that also works between Nigeria, Ghana, and Germany, Ngozi also reflects on the experiences not only of being a woman in Nigeria, but also a woman, an African woman in Europe. And here the intersectionality of gender and race must also be understood from these different positionings. In her installation, Unframed Narratives, The Blind Spot, Schommers was commissioned to work with a collection from the Kunsthallen Bremen Museum. And here she decided to focus upon objects such as tea caddies that had representations of the African woman as an exotic other. There is a long-standing history, a problematic history of European representations of African women in the arts, but also visible in everyday objects. And these are very much tied to the colonial project and create an otherness that, as Homi Bhabha describes, is at once an object of desire and derision. So Ngozi juxtaposes these images and objects alongside her own portraits of African women from Nigeria, Ghana, and Germany, as she sees them, and she confronts the viewer, if you like, with this history. Similar experiences of dislocation are explored in the videos of Wura, Natasha Al Gonji. As a visual artist and performer who studied and exhibited in the US and currently based in Lagos, she describes her performances as using her body to understand and experience acts of return and recollection. And she explores this in a series of videos, including the one you have on screen, The Epic Crossing of an Ife Head, where she specifically addresses identity as framed through the experience of someone who's displaced and longing for homeland. Through her female body, which contrasts the masculinity of the male kings of the Ife heads, Wura marks herself with the male insignia of kingship in the Ife head. She takes on the persona of the iconic Nigerian Ife head and attempts to walk over water and fly across land, as would an ancestor from Africa seeking her descendants in the Americas, making an imagined journey across the Atlantic. She embodies a kingship from which women are excluded and uses stop-motion editing techniques to achieve this journey as she flies across land and water. Of course, on another note, it's also possible to reframe this piece of work around a wider discourse on the repatriation of the Benin bronzes. Like Ngozi, Wura also visits identity from these multiple positions. In her performance, which was based in Lagos, Will I Still Carry Water When I'm a Dead Woman?, she draws attention to the gendering of certain roles, such as the carrying of water, which questions this normalized gendered behavior to make a wider commentary about the role of women in Nigerian society. During the 2-hour walk, the performers drag bottles of water, and as they walk, gradually the bottles become eroded and emptied. And so by the end of the performance, the bottle is empty. Paradoxically, she also draws on the imagery typically associated with the Egungun masquerade, which you can see on the left of screen. And the Egungun are believed to be named and unnamed ancestors of Yoruba-speaking lineages. Typically, you can recognize the Egungun by the layers of cloth that are covering the body, and it's usually a practice that is only performed by men. And so the masquerader occupies a sort of sacred space where one is not able to touch the dancer. So this leads me now to the last artist I wanted to talk about, and who we're really lucky to have join us today, and who also uses a range of different materials, Peju Alatisha. So it was hard to settle on one or two pieces to talk about, as Peju Alatisha's work oftentimes points to themes of gender and space and transports you to discrete moments that belong to a larger story. I see Peju Alatisha as a storyteller, able to conjure up spaces in one's mind of moments at times surreal or otherworldly, but at the same time very familiar and intimate. In interviews, she's frequently said that her stories are informed by events around her, in the news, personal experiences, things observed, and on many of these occasions, her work draws attention to the woman or girl. Her stories move across sculptural or architectural spaces, performative spaces, screen spaces. As an artist, literary writer who trained in architecture, her work has often been described as an Afro-feminist space of expression. Much of her work speaks of the lived conditions of women in Nigeria, sometimes based on her own experiences of discrimination, other times inspired by events that take place, a 9-year-old bride, the kidnapping of women in the north, child domestic workers. They draw upon visual references that are firmly located within a Nigerian space, and they provide commentary on social injustices as experienced in Nigeria. In this piece, for example, Orange Scarf Will Not Go to Heaven, Peju Alatisha recounts her own experience as a 16-year-old girl, being stopped from entering a prayer on account of the orange scarf that she wore. Having been told it was a distraction, she was then given a warning and a book detailing the punishments in hell for women. On many occasions, Peju Alatisha's work exists in different spaces. As I said earlier, in text, as a story, in sculpture, or in film. And this is true as well of this piece, her installation Flying Girls, which is based on one of her stories, exists as a sculpture, but is also, you're able to view the story as part of the online exhibition linked to this event. She describes a fictional character which she created, a child called Singh, who lives in two realities. In one reality, she is a young, rented out servant girl who works in Lagos, neglected by adults. In another reality, she is a girl that's able to fly in an imaginary world of birds and butterflies. In one dimension, she works, in another, she has the ability to travel to the moon, making friends with shadows. Of course, this piece draws attention to domestic help as a portion of disenfranchised people within Nigerian society, and also child labor, which is still an ongoing issue. In this particular scene, she wakes up on the moon and she's looking for a friend and finds these sleeping shadows. She wakes them up and they all come to life. And that's why the piece is called Flying Girls. So to conclude, these artists' work raise issues about the articulation, local and transnational political commentary about gender, and specifically experiences relating to women, which cannot be fully understood without understanding the cultural context in which it plays out. In their different ways, the artists I've discussed today draw upon their experiences and identities of being a Nigerian woman as creative impetus for making their art, informed by these histories, spaces, contexts, whilst at the same time remembering that these are not fixed. Knowing, for example, that Adira is only produced by women means that we are able to understand how Laiwola invites us to reimagine the creation and the uses of textiles as a metaphor for social political ideas. Or knowing that Egungun masquerade is only practiced by men means that we understand better Wura's performance as an invitation for women to consider themselves as untouchables in a public space. Or understanding the importance of Imogwo for Igbo women enables us to read Shoma's challenges to Nigerian society and the pressure it places upon fertility and the gendered role of the mother. But above all else, each of these sculptures, each of these artists' interventions reformulate space. For one cannot look at Peju Alatisha's sculptures or read her stories without acknowledging that the world she creates, as she reimagines these spaces, sets out to contest the gendered roles that position the woman and girl, and I'm quoting Peju here, as destined to be quiet, be still, move slowly, whisper only, and not be. Thank you.